Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the last lecture of our last full week. And we've got one more next Monday, but in a lot of ways, we're getting through our major content here today. So thank you for bearing with me. We are taking a look at Susan Wolf's Meaningfulness, the third dimension of the good life. Now, we saw Wolf already in this course, so this is the second time we've seen her pop up. So we also saw her in a much shorter piece commenting on Scheffler and the afterlife. And there she made some comments that I think resonate really well with what she says in this piece. There's also another shortened version of something she's written in our course reader. Now, Wolf has written on meaning of life in more than one book. She writes on values more generally as well. So I find it a little odd that we don't have at least one longer piece from her in our current text. So as I've said before, I think the reader we have is really the best text that I've found on the market. In fact, I think it's the only one I've found on the market for the meaning of life. And it has a lot of good content in it, but there are certainly a few additional people I'd like to see in there and a few additional pieces. And certainly this one from Wolf, I think, the one that I've assigned and stuck up on Moodle for you, I think is a very nice one where she expresses her main view quite clearly, and it's well organized. But she is certainly somebody worth taking seriously on this subject. So what are we going to see from Wolf? Well, she talks some about how meaningfulness is something distinct from morality as well as happiness. And so here we see some similarity with Keeks, where Keeks is saying, morality is certainly important in certain sorts of ways, but it's not the same thing as meaning. I think Wolf takes that a little bit further in just talking about happiness, and that resonates with some of the other people we've heard before. She introduces a few different views. Some of them are certainly going to be familiar. So she introduces and then ultimately rejects what she calls the fulfillment view, larger than oneself view, and the bipartite view. And then she gives the fitting fulfillment view as really the best view. So her own view is this fitting fulfillment view that she puts forward and defends in the piece. Lastly, right near the end of the piece, she responds to some worries about objective values because she thinks that's really part of the fitting fulfillment view, is that there's this role for objective values in there, which is something that Keeks certainly is talking about. He thinks that, if we're manipulated or we're sort of tricked into valuing things that aren't really valuable, that's going to be a problem. But he also thinks that morality isn't necessary for a meaningful life, that you can dedicate one's life to non-moral projects or potentially even immoral projects. We're going to see that Wolf has a little bit more emphasis on positive dimensions of morality, although she thinks meaningfulness is still something distinct from it, at least distinct in a certain kind of way. Engagement, the right sort of engagement with projects that are objectively valuable are really the core of Wolf's view. So we're going to see what that looks like. Okay, so what does Wolf have to tell us? Well, she starts off by discussing and thinking about happiness, morality, different categories of values. And we've talked a little bit about this. We can think about, say, aesthetic value, the value of art or music or something like that. Aesthetic appreciation, aesthetic value is something different from, say, moral value, and even moral value can be something different from, say, happiness. And so Wolf says, traditionally philosophy has been willing to acknowledge morality as one kind of value, so moral value, and happiness as another category of value, and talk about how those things can come into conflict. So, maybe it's right for you to do something, say tell the truth, even though it's not going to make you happy. Which should you do, or what's the relationship between morality and happiness? Because of course, ideally, and she sort of mentions this, and Keeks talks about this some as well, ideally, morality and happiness just come together. If you always do the morally right thing, you'll just be happy. Unfortunately, the world doesn't seem to be put together in such a way that things are always so nice and neat, right? Quite often, by doing something that seems at least morally dubious, some happiness can be derived from it, particularly if you don't have a conscience that's going to bother you about it. So, you know, just using examples about, say, lying, maybe not even be necessarily lying, but say you're trying to sell something, you're a salesperson of some sort. You know, could be used cars or financial products or who knows what. Maybe you're just not completely forthcoming, right? So you're trying to sell a used car and you know the tires aren't very good, but you just don't draw attention to it. You know, if put on the spot and asked about it, you wouldn't lie and say the tires are great, but you just sort of fail to mention issues or problems or something like that. As a result, you make more sales, you make more money, and if you don't feel guilty about what you're doing, and we've got this great capacity of justifying things to ourselves, then maybe, in fact, by doing things that are at least morally dubious, you can be happier, right? So these categories can come apart. Philosophy is often quite interested in the relationship between the two. You know, what is it that makes us happy? What does morality really demand? How do these things fit together? What do you do in situations when they come apart? So enough talking about that. Just in general, Wolff says, happiness is typically seen as something individual, right? So we talk about our own happiness, right? My happiness and your happiness, the happiness of all various different sorts of people. And morality is really other concerning in some sense. So when we're worried about morality, we're worried about how we should act interpersonally, how we should, you know, how our actions affect other people. And when we're talking about happiness, we're generally concerned with how our actions affect ourselves. And this is precisely where that tension can come in. Now, there's two models of practical reason that accompany these categories. So practical reason, philosophers generally make this other distinction between practical and theoretical reason. So theoretical reason is you know, really reasoning about completely theoretical topics. So, you know, what's the structure of an atom, or, you know, what are quarks, or, you know, what's a cause, or, you know, you can think about some of these topics, right, that seem theoretical. They don't seem to have some kind of practical upshot. Practical reason, by contrast, applies precisely to our actions, the decisions we have to make, and so on. So practical reason tends to encompass the domains of morality, political philosophy, philosophy of law, really anything where we're really thinking about what we should do, what we should and shouldn't do. So practical reason is generally about that. Now, within those domains, think about just sort of models of reasoning. You know, how do we reason? What does good practical reasoning look like? There is the egoistic model, which really just focuses on the individual. So egoism is really about, you know, being self-centered, looking out for number one, of course, yourself. So there's the egoistic model that focuses on what's good for you. And so you can find egoistic models, even of morality, that really say, look, you know, looking out for yourself and putting yourself first is the right thing to do. That kind of model, you get less of this tension between what morality demands and what happiness is, because if morality just tells you to be as happy as possible, it helps dissolve a lot of tensions there. But there's another model that I think is probably more influential, it's more widely favored, which is dualistic model. And I might even be wrong about that claim, that it's more widely favored, but I think this is a very commonly accepted model, or one that a lot of people would certainly like to be the correct model. It's a dualistic model because it recognizes that there can be a tension even in our practical reasoning, where we can think on one side about what's good for us as individuals, you know, what will make me happy. On the other side, there's what's good for the group or what's good for other people, so moral concerns, and these two things can come into conflict, right? Well, I know if I tell the truth, that's going to be good for other people, but it's going to make me unhappy because, you know, maybe I'm telling the truth about how I screwed up or whatever it is. So we've got these two models of reasoning, Wolff says, and we've got these two categories of value as well, right? So we've got happiness and morality. We've got these two models that balance those considerations in different sorts of ways. So Wolff's sort of explaining all this, and she said what really both of these models of practical reason tend to ignore, as well as the categorizing of values, you know, talk about happiness and morality, are what she calls the reasons of love. And in fact, we saw Harry Frankfurt back talking about the afterlife in with Wolff and Scheffler. And Woolf here is actually citing Frankfurt because Frankfurt has a book called The Reasons of Love, in which he outlines that, basically the case that philosophy has largely ignored love as some sort of independent source of value and one that can provide us reasons to do things. So as Woolf talks about it, she's basically taking on Frankfurt's view there and saying, yeah, I think Frankfurt basically gets it right, and so I want to do something with that and incorporate that in my own thinking. If we've been going through the course and you're getting the sense that philosophy is really just a lot of infighting and nobody's ever happy about anything, and we're all just at each other's throats all the time, because of the disagreement, that's not necessarily the case. We do, in a sense, fight a lot. Well, maybe I shouldn't even say fight a lot. We argue a lot because that's what we do. We construct arguments, we read arguments, we think about arguments, we evaluate arguments, we argue. That's just what it is. But you don't necessarily have to fight with someone to argue with them, especially if you're both committed to the same thing, say, trying to figure out what the best view is, figure out what the truth is, or see where the best reasons lead us. So this is a great example where Woolf is drawing on Frankfurt, saying, so, Frankfurt has this whole book, he's got this whole account, I think it's basically right, so I'm going to take it on board, and now I'm going to do something with it. I'm going to try to build on that or apply it to something new and interesting. And I hope you've certainly felt like you get the opportunity to do that in this course as well, where not only can you engage with and disagree with people, but take a look at something and say, yeah, that's actually a really good view, and now I want to apply it to a new example or add a new reason for why that's right or something. Okay, so these reasons of love that Woolf says have been largely ignored in philosophy. She says these reasons, so our love of other people and other things itself gives us reasons to act in certain sorts of ways, and those reasons are really distinct from the reasons of happiness and the reasons of morality. And so she gives some examples of, working really hard, say on the article she's working on, or staying up late to, make a costume for her daughter or something like that, that the thing she loves, say her daughter, philosophy, whatever it might be, itself gives us reasons to act in a certain kind of way. And part of the underlying model there that she's working with is that when we love something, we take the thing to be independently valuable. So our love of things itself causes us to act in certain ways, and that's distinct from just happiness. So she says we can act out of love for something, but it doesn't have to be the same as acting in a way that makes us happy, because some of the things we do for love might not really make us happy. And it's not the same thing as morality, because even though morality is other concerning, generally speaking, ethical theory and philosophy, so theories concerning morality, what should we do, how should we treat people, how should we act, often, not always, but often have left out special relationships, say between a parent and a child, or between spouses or romantic partners and this kind of thing. That's an area in sort of traditional moral theorizing that's been really underdeveloped and not focused on very much. So Woolf says, okay, so I think love really gives us these other reasons. So we have to at least supplement that old model of different kinds of reasoning to take account of love. And of course, we also need to recognize that sometimes when we're acting out of love, we do things that make us act for it. Right? We make bad decisions in some sense. So, say you love someone and they wind up in prison or something, and you try to break them out. Maybe that would be an immoral act of some sort. Maybe not. We'd have to get into a larger discussion about that. But out of love, you could do something that might be actually wrong, right? Out of love for your romantic partner, you really want them to get the big promotion, and so you go out of your way to sabotage the other major contender for the promotion. You slash their tires and sabotage their work and all this other stuff to really, try to put your partner in the limelight, right? That's probably not a good thing to do, even if it's motivated by love for your partner. You wind up doing things that aren't right. So Woolf puts it together, I think, sort of quite nicely here. She says, being prone to be moved and guided by reasons of love, when the objects of love are worthy, is, I believe, at the core of our ability to live meaningful lives. So she thinks these reasons of love are really important, and of special note, right, when the objects of love are worthy. Because she says as well, our love can be misplaced, right? We can love something that doesn't really deserve it. She just gives the kind of stock example where, say, you've got two people in some kind of romantic relationship, and one person gives up a lot of things to be with the other person, and just that whole notion that we at least sometimes get of, yeah, that person's not really worth it, right? The person making the sacrifice really deserves more, deserves a better partner. So even though Woolf is interested in love and thinks that's something really important here, she is, I guess I'll just say, clear-eyed about it, right? Sometimes love makes us act poorly. Sometimes we're mistaken in some sense about what we love and whether or not it's really worth it. So she's not just sort of being sort of silly or ignoring all these important facts here, but she's trying to draw attention to the role that love and when we love objects that really are valuable, they're worthy of being loved, how that is really somehow at the core or really important for a meaningful life. Now, we've got this on the table, right? So this is the basic view, and this is what we're going to come back to. So she wants to look at two popular views of the meaning of life, what she calls the fulfillment view and the larger than oneself view. She wants to look at both of these, think about them, and then ultimately reject them. So we're going to look at these two views next. Woolf is going to explain what they are, give some reasons to think that they aren't particularly good views, that they certainly aren't enough on their own. She's then going to look at another view that tries to just pull these two together in a kind of Frankenstein model. It's sort of like, okay, the fitting fulfillment view plus the larger than oneself view. And she says that's not going to quite work either. Then she's going to give her own model. So we're moving on to her looking at views that she ultimately wants to reject. So starting with the fulfillment view, right? On this fulfillment view, this is really Taylor's view again. This is the one that Keeks was looking at, the subjective view, right? So Woolf is calling it the fulfillment view. You could call it the subjective view as well. And this, again, why it's so important to define what you mean when you're using terms, especially in philosophy, but really any enterprise, any sort of intellectual enterprise that requires you to be careful with what you're thinking and saying and doing, because it requires attention to detail. It's defining what you mean. So I said subjective view. She's saying fulfillment view. So far as I'm concerned, for my purposes here, those mean the same thing. They're synonymous. The subjective view and the fulfillment view are just synonymous for what I'm doing right now. Right? So in the fulfillment view, as she characterizes it, the necessary and sufficient condition for meaningful life is that it is characterized by having feelings of fulfillment. So again, just think about Taylor and think about how Keeks was talking about Taylor, right? On Taylor's view, if Sisyphus is happy rolling rocks up the hill, he feels fulfilled, and that's just what he wants to do, that's it, right? There's nothing more to be said about it, right? Because of course Taylor rejects any kind of objective purpose or goal or anything like that. He says it's just not going to work, right? It's going to lead to boredom, right? If you've done everything, if it's not everything, eventually the project's going to sort of lose its value over time or something like that. So of course, Keeks thinks that there's some kind of problem here because we need to make some sort of room for objective values in some sense, although he shrinks back from saying a meaningful life needs to be a morally good one. Woolf is doing something similar. So Woolf and Keeks are, to some extent, on the same page. Certainly, here again, a potentially fruitful topic for an interesting comparison or something like that. To what extent are Keeks and Woolf really saying the same thing? And Woolf herself even talks about Taylor and Taylor's Sisyphus and all this. So here again, you can see how in philosophy, part of what it is sort of doing good philosophy is seeing how different views interact with each other, build on each other. When you can pick out parts of views that make sense and you think are quite reasonable, and identify other areas where you think there's some kind of problem. So we analyze things, right? We look at all the various parts, evaluate them, potentially separately, right, or in conjunction, and develop new permutations of these things. How do they fit together? Can we fit them together in different sorts of ways, ways that are better, and so on? So Woolf says, this subjective view or this purely fulfillment view is that really just that we feel fulfilled. We're doing what we really want. Having feelings of fulfillment are not the same as having feelings of pleasure. Right? Wolf thinks that's important to note. And these feelings of fulfillment, as she says, are the opposite of the very bad feelings of boredom and alienation. So when we feel fulfilled, we aren't bored. Instead, we're gripped, we're engaged. We also aren't alienated. We're not sort of distanced from something or made to feel sort of estranged from it or odd or the alienation is really being, when we think about the term alien in general, it really means like something different or from somewhere else, or when we're alienated from something, we feel distanced from it in some sense. So this is really what Wolf is getting at. Those feelings of fulfillment, they seem required in some sense for a meaningful life. And one very sort of popular view, this would be sort of pop psychology. I'm sure you can find a million books on this if you look at chapters or whatever. And Wolf, in fact, even cites some books she found, on Discount Bin or something. That basically puts this view forward. It's basically find your passion, right? Do what gets you going. And she said, well, there's something important and interesting about that, but there's still this problem that if the individual engages in certain sorts of activities that aren't valuable, and those seem to provide the feelings of fulfillment, she thinks there's a real problem here. So, just going back to some of the stock examples I've already talked about, if what really gets you going is, counting the blades of grass in your front lawn, or, as Wolf points out, like handwriting on copies of War and Peace, or, watching reality television, or, she even sort of goofs around with a couple fun ones, just like sitting around smoking pot all day, or, like doing crossword puzzles. She says those on their own, even if they provide you feelings of fulfillment, don't seem like they are objectively valuable in the right kind of way to really make a life meaningful. And so she's going to come back to this later. So, and here again, think about Sisyphus and Taylor's version of Sisyphus, where he just wants to roll the rock up the hill over and over and over again. There's something about that strikes Wolf as unusual and probably wrong. So this is why she thinks just the fulfillment view on its own isn't going to be enough. Okay, so another fairly popular view, right? One that's sort of easy to think about is the larger than oneself view. This is where we place meaning in projects that we engage in. And the whole idea, and Wolf talks about this a little bit, it's not that the project's actually larger than yourself, right? It's not to be taken literally. It's not like it's a big project, at least, physically larger than you as a human or something like that. Rather, it's that the projects themselves are somehow valuable. So rather than trying to locate meaning in our feelings, it tries to locate it in the worth of our projects. Now, as I was just mentioning, what Wolf really takes this view to be, so this sort of popular phrase, there's popular thought, engage in something larger than yourself, like get involved in something, get involved in a movement or right, an enterprise, something like this. The whole idea is that the value of that thing that you get involved with is somehow independent and has its source outside of itself. So part of the problem with the fulfillment view is that it can focus way too much just on how the individual feels and then totally ignore the actual worth of the projects, right? The actual value of the thing, in a way that leads to a kind of undesirable, I'll use the word relativism, maybe that's not even quite right. Just whatever gets you going is good enough, right? No matter what it is, no matter whether it's helping the world become a better place, or I don't even know, right? Very, very carefully shredding documents and then taping together all the little pieces of paper into a very, very long string or something. Right? I don't know. I'm just making this up. Okay, so we've got these two views that Wolf says, in evaluating each of them, she says, it seems like there's something going for both of these, but they also both leave something important out. Right? And really what they're leaving out that's important is what the other view focuses on. So those feelings of fulfillment seem really important for a meaningful life. But it also seems important for a meaningful life that the projects that make us feel fulfilled, or that the projects that we devote at least some of our time to are worthwhile projects. But she says each of these views just sort of leaves the other view out. So what are we to do? Well, we can try to pull them together in a couple of different ways. And so one way to try to pull them together is the bipartite view. So we'll flip over to this here. So this bipartite view, really, like two-part view, maybe if you want to think about that. So, each of these different accounts really leaves out what the other account focuses on, right? The larger than oneself view doesn't take our feelings of fulfillment into account. The fulfillment view doesn't take the value of our projects into account. So the bipartite view tries to combine those two views to find meaning, right? She says, on this bipartite view, in order for a life to be meaningful, both an objective and a subjective condition must be met, right? That we have the feelings of fulfillment, and that we engage in projects of worth somehow. But she says, ultimately, this view isn't a good one. It's problematic. Why? Precisely because it's a kind of Frankenstein. It just sort of takes the other two views and puts them together, but doesn't put them together in a way that makes a single sort of coherent whole out of them, but rather keeps them separate and just jams them together. So it's really just a kind of conjunction. It says, okay, you have to have feelings of fulfillment from somewhere, right? I don't care what it is. You also have to engage in projects of worth, but the feelings of fulfillment don't need to come from the projects of worth. So say you dedicate a lot of your time to make the world a better place, but you find that boring and alienating. You do it out of a moral concern that it's like, I know I should do this, but I just hate doing it. I just don't enjoy it. What I really like to do is count those blades of grass on my lawn, or watch reality TV, or whatever, right? And those give you those feelings of fulfillment that we need for a meaningful life. And you're engaging in projects of worth, but they don't have the right relationship to each other. And so this is why Wolf wants to reject the bipartite view that just sort of adds them together, says you need this thing and that thing, but they don't have to have any special relationship to each other. You just need both. She says, if meaningfulness is understood to refer to a coherent dimension of value, it would be puzzling if it turned out to depend on the satisfaction of two unrelated conditions. So she thinks meaningfulness in life, right, just like, say, in some sense, being happy and being a morally good person and so on, if we think meaningfulness is a coherent dimension of value, it's its own thing, right? It's, as she, the title of this piece puts it, it's a third dimension of the good life. We want to be happy, we want to be morally good, and we want to have meaning. And meaning is some third thing. It's not just some combination of the other two. She says it seems weird that the bipartite view would be the correct one. That we have this specific part of our life, that value, meaning is this part of value on its own. But that to satisfy this condition of having a meaningful life, you actually have to do these various other unrelated things. So that it just seems odd, right? It doesn't seem like that's the right answer. So, just following up on this, she continues this quote at the bottom here. She says, if we really consider the two conditions of meaningfulness proposed by the bipartite view as criteria to be taken separately, it is not clear that they contribute to the goodness of a person's life at all. And this is exactly what I was saying, that if we get our feelings of fulfillment from things that really aren't worthwhile, they aren't worthy of our love or attention or value, right? You get your feelings of fulfillment just from sitting around, using drugs or something. But then you also go out of your way to do worthwhile projects that help other people, or make the world a better place or something. But you don't get the feelings of fulfillment from that. She thinks that there's something sort of incoherent or problematic there. Okay, so that's why she wants to reject the bipartite view. This brings us around to the fitting fulfillment view, which is offered as this alternative. So what the fitting fulfillment view does is it really takes those two separate conditions and tries to fuse them together into one coherent whole. So instead of just having them separately and saying you need both of these unrelated things, right? It doesn't matter how they relate to each other, they can be completely different. She says, okay, we need to pull those together. That I don't know how to do it, right? Really, what it is now is that you get the feelings of fulfillment from the right kinds of things. So it's fitting fulfillment, right? It's not just fulfillment. It's fulfillment from the right kind of sources. So it's, as she puts it, right, on the fitting fulfillment view, it's that one's life be actively and lovingly engaged in projects that give rise to this feeling of fulfillment, when the projects in question can be seen to have a certain objective kind of worth. So this is what she thinks really matters. So she goes on to explain, she says, like the fulfillment view, the fitting fulfillment view identifies a feature that gives this recognizable benefit of feeling fulfilled to the person whose life possesses it. According to the latter view, however, the fitting fulfillment view, what is distinctively valuable is not the state or ongoing experience of fulfillment considered in itself. Rather, what is valuable is that one's life be actively and lovingly engaged in projects that give rise to this feeling, when the projects in question can be seen to have a certain objective kind of work. So really what this view is doing is fusing together the other two views and saying, okay, to have a meaningful life, you have to feel fulfilled, but you have to feel fulfilled for the right kinds of reasons, right? It's that you derive those feelings of fulfillment from engaging with projects that are objectively worthy, of things that, really are worthwhile, things that are worth doing and caring for, right? It's really about loving things in the right kind of way. So it doesn't have to even be loving people, right? You can love art, or love a project, or love a community, or love a sport, or love learning, or whatever, right? But it has to be something worthwhile. So, if you just love, reality television, or just something that's not really valuable on its own, or not sort of doesn't have a certain objective kind of worth, right? And she leaves this a little bit open, and we're going to talk a bit more about this, because she, sort of recognizes she's got kind of a weak account of objective value. She says, so it's really about getting feelings of fulfillment from the right sorts of places, right? That's really what matters. So you can have a meaningful life by, caring for your family, caring for your community, and so on, engaging in those right sorts of projects, and feeling fulfilled from it. Okay. So, thinking a little bit more about this, Woolf notes that we're social creatures, right? We engage with other people. We want other people's approval, right? This is a very common feature of humans. Of course, certainly some of us say, oh, I really don't care what other people think about me. Often that seems like a defense mechanism. If we think other people don't care about us or don't approve of us in the right kind of way, for some people it's probably true, but we often spend a lot of time and energy thinking about other people and how they judge us, and trying to fit in, and all these sorts of things, right? But one way we go about this is engaging in projects of independent objective value, right? Engaging with worthwhile projects. So she talks about different sorts of projects. And she says, sometimes people even engage in projects that aren't appreciated at the time, but they do it recognizing that at some point those projects will be, at least hopefully recognized. So say, being an artist ahead of your time, or being a scientist or something, it's like being a scientist, researching things and having other people not believe your theories or your results, or what have you. But you go on doing it in the anticipation, or at least hope, that at some future point, people will understand it, right? There will eventually be an audience, or a group of people who will look at what you're doing and say, yeah, that was really worthwhile, right? I'm glad that person sacrificed their time and energy, or in some sense their life, into doing whatever it was that they were doing. So Woolf thinks this is an important part of us and what we do, and that a lot of the feelings of fulfillment that we do get about what the things we take to be important, we take them to be important, and we feel fulfilled precisely because of those interpersonal roles these things play. Right? We know that other people are going to care about it. That's why we think it's worth doing. Now, Woolf acknowledges that thinking about objective values is tricky and difficult. especially in philosophy, when we start asking difficult questions about, like, well, what kind of thing would objective value be? How does it fit into the world? How do we make sense of that? How do we figure out what is objectively valuable and so on, given that we disagree over values? She says, okay, it's a tricky, hard thing to think about. She admits that she doesn't have a fully worked out theory of objective values. So this is one area where she's pointing out her own assumption, right? I'm assuming objective values are real. These are a thing that eventually we'll have a good account of them. We don't yet, or at least she doesn't think we do yet. Wolf says, look, I'm assuming the objective values are real, that we can make some sense of that, even if we have trouble doing it. So she does try to respond to a couple of particular words, and that's parochialism and elitism. So that was the first one, and then the second one is the philosophical status of objective values. So we're going to take a quick look at both of these and her responses to them. So the first one, parochialism, is really like being too narrow. Right? If somebody's parochial, they have a very narrow view of things. Elitism, doesn't really require, explanation. So this first worry is that really we're going to fall into this trap of excluding what a lot of people find valuable, right? Being too elitist and say, oh yeah, what most people think is valuable isn't very good, or being parochial and saying, only the things I think are valuable really are valuable, objectively speaking. And so the way Wolf wants to respond to this is really by, making a claim to being humble about it, saying, look, we're fallible, we get things wrong. I'm not going to pretend like I've got all the answers about what sorts of things in particular are objectively valuable. And certainly what she's not interested in trying to do is establish a rank order of objective values, right? She's not saying, oh, we should figure out what's the most objectively valuable. And those, lives engaged with that kind of thing or activity are going to be the most meaningful, and then we're going to have this sort of hierarchy or ranking of them, right? That's not what she's interested in doing. Instead, she advocates a kind of inclusive, pluralistic approach to objective values. Ultimately, she thinks, what people have thought are valuable over time should really be regarded as such. So she says, my own inclination is to be generous in my tentative judgments about what is valuable. I expect that almost anything that a significant number of people have taken to be valuable over a large span of time is valuable. So she's trying to stay on a much more general level. So, just what she says there, almost anything that a significant number of people have taken to be valuable over a large span of time is valuable. That's her own guiding principle. So again, think very sort of largely here, right? What can that include? Well, things like family, right? Caring about family, friends, religion, very broadly speaking, community, right? Art, knowledge, right? We can think about things in these larger sort of general categories. And of course, we can get more specific and narrow if we want and think there as well. But really, she wants to try to stay pretty open-minded and pretty broad. And that's how she wants to respond to this first potential objection for her reliance on objective values. The second one is the philosophical status of objective values. I've already talked about this a little bit. So Wolf, says, look, my account, the fitting fulfillment view requires that objective values be out there. She doesn't think it's unreasonable to think they exist, right? Like maybe they don't. That would be bad. That would be problematic. That would be a serious problem for her view. In fact, the view won't work anymore because it requires that objective values exist. So really, she's sort of assuming that they exist. She doesn't think that's an unreasonable assumption. And here again, what she's not doing here is trying to give an account of objective values. She's trying to give an account of meaning in life. And so she says, really, meaning in life is going to depend on the existence of objective values. Or perhaps even she would try to modify the view somehow if she came to believe that objective values didn't exist. Maybe the view would then come to rely on believing falsely that objective values exist. But I don't know. That's getting ahead of ourselves. So Wolf says, this isn't an unreasonable assumption. There's at least one defining feature of objective values that we can identify, right, that they'd be truth apt. That is, we can be wrong about our judgments of value. So, Wolf just admits, yes, I don't have a full account of objective values. I'm just going to assume that they exist. The account needs it. Whatever it turns out they really are, whatever the full theory of objective values finally says, they're going to have to say that they're truth apt. That's just, when we're talking about objective values, that's just what we mean. These are values whose value or standing are independent of what individual humans think. So this stands in contrast to Taylor's subjectivism, right? It's not just, oh, it's valuable to you if you think it is, and that there's just nothing beyond that. Wolf really wants to go out on a limb along with Keeks and say, no, things can really fail to have value, right? You can be wrong. You can think something's valuable when it isn't. You can think it isn't valuable when it is, right? Ideally, you get things right. You recognize what is and is not objectively valuable and adjust your actions accordingly. Okay, so Wolf wants to go on to apply, in some sense, or really give an example of the fitting fulfillment view in the form of civic volunteering. So what is civic volunteering? She talks about it a little bit. She says there are certain features that we can use to pick out what civic volunteering really is. She says civic projects aim at benefiting others or a group, and the group must include people who are not members of one's own family. So we're talking about civic volunteering. It's not, right? It can't be out of pure self-interest. So it can't be just doing things for yourself. She says it can't even be doing things just for your own family, because our families are so closely related to us. It's hard to even tease apart our identity from our family or separate our interests from our family's interests. So civic volunteering is really volunteering for one's community or the society around, right? Helping other people. And she says this is a very good example of the fitting fulfillment view. Volunteers, right? It's really this kind of volunteering. People go give their time, energy, etc., to make the world a better place, to help their communities and their environments and so on. They see the work they do as valuable, right? So, and the value of the activity is outside of themselves. So when people go and volunteer, they don't go and do it and say, this is worthwhile because it's going to make me feel good. Instead, they think the volunteering itself is something good, right? It's a good project. It's a good end or whatnot. And it's engaging in the valuable project that makes them feel good. If people went into it just trying to get the feelings of fulfillment, but saw the project itself or the activity as worthless and pointless and not worth doing, etc., they probably wouldn't get those feelings of fulfillment. So the volunteers, often, not always, right, because there's this kind of coercive volunteering that can happen. Wolf talks about this a little bit too, where people can be kind of forced to volunteer for something, or, oh, you've got to go volunteer to qualify for this scholarship or whatever. And so there you might go volunteer without really wanting to, right? So you might not see the work you're doing as valuable. Hopefully you do. But, so volunteers typically see the work they're doing as valuable. They connect with other like-minded people, right? People that also see these things as valuable and are willing to spend their time. And the importance of that task is highlighted just by the fact of volunteering to do it rather than getting paid for instance. So Wolf thinks that this general activity, civic volunteering, really fits the bill, right, for the fitting fulfillment view. Being somebody who engages in this kind of activity is a good candidate for having a meaningful life because they're engaged in projects that are objectively valuable. And hopefully, right, if they derive feelings of fulfillment from engaging in those projects, then they're going to have feelings of fulfillment in their life, which are necessary for a meaningful life. And they're also going to be engaged in projects of worth, which is also necessary. And Wolf thinks, and it's necessary that we get the feelings of fulfillment from those projects of worth, right, rather than the bipartite view that just sees them totally separate. So, a life characterized by civic volunteering would be a meaningful one on Wolf's account. Now, is it the only one? No, right? This is one particular example, but it can act perhaps as a kind of model or at least one concrete instance of the kind of life that Wolf would willing to be judged as meaningful. Right? So really anybody who derives feelings of fulfillment from a project whose value is independent of themselves will ultimately lead a meaningful life on Woolf's account. As she puts it, meaning arises when subjective attraction meets objective attractiveness, and one is able to do something good or positive about it. And so here again, like Keeks, Woolf is willing to say, look, we probably shouldn't be too hasty in passing judgment on other people, but we shouldn't shrink from it either. And she talks a little bit about this when she's talking about objective values, that she thinks at least part of the reticence or hesitation in resisting the fulfillment view and going for, say, the fitting fulfillment view is precisely this hesitation we have, or this reluctance to judge what other people do, what they do and they say. And so, on the fulfillment view, in some sense, it's very value neutral. It's just like, do whatever gets you going, do whatever you're engaged with, right? It doesn't matter what it is. But part of Woolf's whole point is that there are some projects that just don't seem like they're the correct candidates for, providing meaning in life. Because some tasks, like Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill forever, even if he feels like doing it, it doesn't seem like an objectively valuable project, precisely because it doesn't lead to anything, it doesn't have any good results, right? It's really this irrational desire he has. So Woolf really thinks there's something to objective values and something to rationality that we can connect to issues of value, which really stand in the background of her whole account. Okay, well, that takes me to the end of my comments on Woolf, and so that takes us to the end of this sort of section on pluralism and objectivity. So Keeks himself describes himself as a pluralist. I'm calling Woolf, saying that she has this objective view, really because she's talking about, on her view, it has to be engaging with projects of objective value or objective worth. You have to be doing that to ultimately lead a meaningful life. That might be something a little new and different from what Keeks was saying, because of course Keeks leaves open, right? He says it's not morality that really matters, but that sort of leaves open, I think, a little bit whether or not we have to be engaged in projects of worth or projects of value. And of course, you can go back and look at Keeks' list of the 7 necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. So maybe there's something in there that makes his view really like Woolf's. Or maybe they're different. Right? I'll leave that open. I'll leave that for you to think about, to explore, maybe argue about. But certainly, we see in Woolf, as well as Keeks, something quite different from what Taylor was saying, most definitely, as well as something that seems different from what Schlick was saying. Because again, for Schlick, it seems to really be about play, it's about joy, it's about being absorbed in our activities in a certain kind of way. That's really what matters, not something like objective value the way Woolf wants to talk about. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. Next week, I'll post one last lecture on John Wisdom and Kai Nielsen, really exploring the question of the meaning of life itself, as well as what sorts of answers we might expect out of it. We've seen a lot of answers already in the course, so that's just going to be kind of an ending piece, just a little bit more reflection on this question. And, was it ever a good question to start with? Now that we've explored a fairly broad range of possible responses to it. Okay, I hope you're doing well. You'll see me on Monday. Until then, have a great weekend, and I hope you feel fulfilled from projects of objective value. Bye.